Hello everybody, and now welcome to Chapter 4 pertaining to market failures caused by externalities and asymmetric information. And when we refer to a market failure, what we're talking about is when a market is no longer operating efficiently, and that's what we mean by it has failed in an economic sense. So efficiently functioning markets are what we strive to achieve in a healthy economy. And then we're going to look at what are known as externalities. And externalities are situations where a product can have unrealized positive or negative benefits. We're also going to look at society's optimum amount of externality reduction. And finally, take a look at what do we mean by asymmetric information. For markets to function efficiently, markets, remember, have to produce the right mix of products and the right amount of products. So a market failure is when a market fails to produce the right amount of a product. Efficiency requires two things. Our demand curve, which we looked at in previous chapters, reflects the full willingness to pay, and our supply curve reflects all of the costs of production. And at first we're going to look at the notion of what is known as a consumer surplus. A consumer surplus is the difference between what a consumer is willing to pay for a good and what they actually pay. So let's say you want to buy a computer and you're willing to spend up to $1,000 for it, and you find it on sale at Best Buy for $800. In that case, you would get a consumer surplus of $200. You paid less than your maximum price you were willing to pay for the computer. Anytime you pay less than your maximum price, you get a consumer surplus. So in this case, we are looking at 6 different individuals and their maximum price they are willing to pay, and the actual price is simply what does this product cost in the economy, and it costs $8. So everybody up until Betty gets a consumer surplus, whereas Betty was willing to pay a maximum of $8. She'll still buy the product because it costs exactly what she would be willing to pay and does not get a surplus as a consequence. The green triangle is all of those consumer surpluses sum totaled. In an economy, we expect consumers to behave rationally, meaning people will buy goods and services up to their maximum price they're willing to pay for them. They're not going to pay more for a product than their maximum willingness to pay for it. So that's how we perceive how consumers operate in an ideal world. We believe that they are all acting in a rational sense. So that's your consumer surplus here. Anytime you buy something for less than you're willing to pay for it, you get a consumer surplus. On the other end of the coin, we have what is known as a producer surplus. And a producer surplus is the difference between the actual price a producer receives and what the minimum price they would be to accept. Let's say you're going to sell your car and it's an old used car, you'll take $3,000 for it, but someone offers you $4,000 for it. In that case, you would get a producer surplus of $1,000. You got $1,000 more than you were willing to let the car go for. So anytime you sell something for more than you would have taken, you realize what is known as a producer surplus. And in this case, we're looking at 6 different producers. They all have minimally acceptable prices. And generally, their minimal acceptable price comes from their cost of production. But every one of these is going to sell their items because even when we get to Chad, his minimum acceptable price is $8. The market price is $8. So you'll sell something for your minimum acceptable price. You just, however, won't go below it. You're not going to sell something where you start losing money, for instance. So in this case, both your consumer and producer surpluses come in situations where you get a benefit. So in this case, we're looking at producer surplus. And the blue triangle is all of those realized producer surpluses sum totaled once again. So let's take a look now at total surplus and the notion of efficiency. And that's going to be on our next slide. If we look here, our consumer and producer surpluses get added up, and we would consider that to be our total surplus. And Q1 is our efficient quantity because that's market equilibrium. That's where our supply and demand curves cross, and that's equilibrium. So what happens if we make too little of something? If we make too little of something, we get what is known as an efficiency loss from underproduction. Too little of something means a product that has some sort of benefit to society and we're not making enough of it. And in this case, what are we getting? We are getting that gray triangle there. That's an efficiency loss from underproduction. Basically what it is a reduction of the combined consumer and producer surplus, and now we're at a quantity level that's less than the efficient quantity. So we have too little of this product in the market. Quantity 1, or equilibrium, is where we should be. We're actually producing it at quantity 2, where there is more demand than supply. We're underproducing this product. We can have too much of a product as well. And if we look here, this is an efficiency loss from overproduction. Once again, it's a reduction of the combined consumer and producer surplus, and that is the gray triangle here on the right. In this case, we're making too much of the product. We have more supply than demand, so we have leftover product, and once again, we consider both shortages and surpluses a negative thing in an economic sense. Equilibrium would be quantity 1. We're actually producing at quantity 3. So when it comes to products themselves, we can have what are known as externalities. And externalities are costs or benefits which accrue to a third party external to the transaction. So we have products we would consider which are both positive and negative to society. What would something possibly be with a positive externality? Let's say you trade in your old gas-guzzling car for a new electric car. Your electric car would have a positive externality in the sense that it makes no tailpipe emissions and overall a lot less pollution to run than your old, let's say, 1990s gas guzzler. And other people are going to benefit besides you. Everybody who lives around you are going to benefit from the fact that it's not making all of this pollution. So we would say it's a positive externality. I may have had nothing to do with you buying an electric car, but I'm going to breathe cleaner air as a consequence. So that's a product with a positive externality. If I put solar panels on the roof of my house, it's going to bring everybody's power costs down and be better for the environment. Once again, positive externality there. Anything with a positive externality, we argue there isn't enough of in the economy. So generally, what do we do in the real world? We try to encourage more of products with positive externalities, and generally via government action. That's why there's currently tax credits on electric cars and solar panels for your home and more efficient heating systems and everything like that. Now, the opposite would be something with a negative externality. And with a negative externality, we would argue too much is produced. So depending on what the product is, you could argue that the proper amount in society is none or a reduced amount. And what that generally means is the actual cost of making this product is less than what it costs society. The producer of this product is not paying the full cost to society, and we have too much of it. An example of something with a negative externality would be something like cigarettes. What have we done with cigarettes in the last several decades? We've put increasingly higher taxes and regulations on them to try to remove a good amount of them from the market. You could say that they have a negative externality, they're harmful to society, and as a consequence, we want to reduce the number of cigarettes by raising their cost. So if we look in the case of positive and negative externalities, what do we get? We get the following. In the case of negative externalities, your producer's supply curve is going to be to the right of the total cost supply curve, or ST. So basically, with something with a negative externality, the person manufacturing this is paying less, their cost is less than what it actually should be, the total cost supply curve. So equilibrium output is greater than the optimal output. Optimal output here is QO, or point A, equilibrium output QE, or point C. So actually, equilibrium here isn't the true optimum output because the people making this product aren't paying the full price of production. or what it costs society. So the actual goal here is to make the cost more expensive, so we move from point C to point A, that optimum quantity. In the other case of the positive externality, your demand is usually too low, so market demand is below total benefit demand curve, so we want to raise demand. That's why things like electric cars are currently being subsidized, and you get payments if you put solar panels on your roof to spur demand to get more people to purchase electric cars, for instance. So on the one on the right, equilibrium output, or QE, is less than your optimum output, or QO, and you get an efficiency loss. That's the gray shaded triangle. In both of these cases, you do have an efficiency loss. So generally, the government tries to correct externalities. So for negative ones, the government generally has two levers they can pull. First are direct controls, so they can completely regulate something. So if it was something that's very polluting, they might ban it completely. They might only allow a certain number of emissions to be polluted. So if you're a power plant, you might not be able to exceed a certain amount of pollution, or a factory, you may not be able to exceed a certain amount of pollution, or you may have to buy new equipment. Those are all forms of direct controls. The government dictating what a company can do and to correct these externalities. They could also put a tax on the product. It's known as a Pigovian tax, and your best example here is cigarettes. Why do we put all of these taxes on cigarettes? We do that to make them more expensive, and it makes the cost more expensive, and as a result, reduces demand for cigarettes, and in theory, that efficiency loss. When positive externalities are present, we generally want to bring more demand into the market. So generally, we subsidize the product. We may also subsidize supply as well. So the government can do two things. In the case of electric cars, there's a large tax credit if you buy an electric car, so that's an example of a subsidy. It reduces your cost. But governments are also paying electric car companies more money to build more factories. Tesla got all kinds of subsidies from the state of Texas to build battery factories. That's an example of subsidizing supply as well. So the government can subsidize supply, demand, or both to get more of these products in the market. And the government can also do what's called a governmental provision, and in that case, it's where the government itself starts manufacturing items. This is rare, but we actually saw this during the COVID pandemic, when the government said there wasn't enough COVID tests and started manufacturing their own to supplement the ones being made by the private market. So if the government deems there isn't enough of something that's crucial to society, and in that case, COVID tests were very important at that time, they may make them as well, and that would be an example of a government provision. Regardless of what they do, when you have a product with a positive externality, you want more of it in society. When you have a product with a negative externality, you want less of it in society. If we look here at slide 14, the same situation is going on here. So we have that negative externality, and now the government's going to correct it by moving from S to ST via direct controls or laws, regulations, or some form of tax. If we look here at slide 15, we have a positive externality, and the government can correct it in one of two ways. They can subsidize consumers, or what we're looking at in part B right here, or they could subsidize producers. That's paying Tesla to build new factories. Part B is a tax credit for your electric car, or they may do both at the same time. More often than not, they subsidize both consumers and producers at the same time. In either case, they want to eliminate that gray triangle or that efficiency loss and have the optimum amount of this beneficial product in society. So once again, we just covered this, but these are when you have negative or positive externalities. A negative externality, we have too much and we're over allocating our resources. A positive one, we have too little, we're under allocating them. Generally, the government does handle it, but more often than not, if you look at ways to correct number one in both cases, private bargaining, oftentimes companies will correct their own externalities before being forced to by the government. Number one, it looks better for them. And number two, companies generally would rather handle something themselves than be told to do by the government. Now, an example of externalities is the following. This is an example for pollution. And you would think you would obviously want as little pollution as possible, but in today's world it is not possible to create all of our power needs and build all of the things we need with no pollution. So we're going to remediate or abate the pollution to what is considered an acceptable level. And just like all of our other things we've looked at so far, we're going to do it up to the point where the benefit of reducing pollution further exactly equals the cost of doing so. It's pretty easy to rectify pollution for a while, but as we get cleaner and cleaner, it becomes harder, more expensive, more time consuming, and eventually we'll hit a point where we've reduced it enough that the benefit of reducing it further becomes less than the costs we would have to incur to do it. So if we look here, there is indeed an equilibrium point, and it's where the benefits cross the costs, and at that point the cost of removing more pollution will start being greater than a benefit that is received by society. So the concept of equilibrium holds true in a great deal of things we're going to look at in our class. Moving to slide 18, let's take a look at the government's role in the economy. And a definition to remember, you're certainly going to see a test question or two on it, is what is known as Coe's theorem. And Coe's theorem is that the private sector or companies themselves can solve externalities. And for the most part, Coe's theorem holds true. Most externalities are fixed by companies themselves. Once again, in today's world, if you are producing something harmful or subject to bad publicity from these externalities, it's going to hurt you as a firm. So companies actually have a reason, they have an impetus to reduce their own externalities. Depending on what it is, however, a lot of times the government does have to step in, but most externalities are corrected without the need of the government. The government, however, when they deem something harmful to society or beneficial to society and not in enough of a quantity, will often step in to try to fix externalities. And the optimum reduction of it, remember, in theory, we want to reduce an externality to the point where the benefits from less of it is equal to the cost of getting rid of less of it. That's not something that we always have a nice chart where we can see lines crossing to come up with. Generally, we need to estimate what the optimal reduction of an externality is. So if the government's going to do this, they have to correctly identify both the existence of this problem and its cause. And you may have government failure. And by government failure, I don't mean the collapse of a government, but I mean the failure of the government to actually rectify the problem. Governments are subject to all sorts of issues. They can be corrupt, they can be inefficient, they can be voted out of office, all of the above. So the government may not be willing or able to actually fix the externality either. Governments aren't perfect. So we don't exactly have a crystal ball to tell us exactly how much or how little of a product we need. So a lot of it is going to be guesswork for something we would consider as an externality. And finally, the other thing which can cause market failure is what is known as asymmetric information, and that's what we're going to conclude this chapter on. Asymmetric information is any time one party in a transaction has a lot more information than the other. Let's say I'm a car dealer and I'm going to sell you a car, and I rolled the odometer back on the car and I'm covering up all kinds of hidden mechanical problems. That would be a situation of asymmetric information. I know the car has all sorts of issues and is a lemon, but I'm not representing it as such to the buyer. The buyer has no way of knowing the car has these issues, and as a consequence, they're going to probably buy something that they never would have if they knew the truth about it. So anytime asymmetric information exists, it causes resources to be allocated inefficiently. You certainly wouldn't buy a car that was a lemon if you knew it was a lemon. And that generally requires government intervention to correct. In the car example now, car dealers have to sign certifications to the odometer. They show you Carfax reports. They do all of this stuff to prove the car is how it is. A lot of them will mechanically inspect the car or let your own mechanic inspect it. Or they might provide a warranty. or the government may make them provide a warranty. Most used cars do have some form of warranty on them. So in all cases, that's examples of government intervention to correct a form of asymmetric information. And asymmetric information can take several forms. Up first would be something like inadequate buyer information about the seller. So let's say the gasoline market. How do you know that when you go to the gas station, you plug the pump in or the attendant fills you up, that you're actually getting what you paid for? Next time you go to a gas pump, take a look at the pump and you're going to see a colorful sticker. They have them in the city, they have them on Long Island, and it'll say either New York City or Nassau County or Suffolk County, Department of Weights and Measures, and in it, it will have a date and it will say that the gas pump's certified. Same thing when you go to the supermarket and they weigh something on a scale. There's Weights and Measures stickers on them as well. So the government actually checks to make sure that the gas pump, when you get 5 gallons of gas, it's actually giving you 5 gallons of gas. Or that when you go to weigh your turkey cold cuts, your pound of turkey is really a pound, and you're not being screwed over by inaccurate equipment. So, what are some other examples? Licensing of professionals like doctors and lawyers. How do you know your doctor's a doctor? Because your doctor's licensed. You can look his or her license up on pretty quickly on the internet. All of the states have all of that information. And you can make sure that your doctor is who they claim they are, or your attorney is who they claim they are. All those licenses are public. You can't just go, I'm a doctor, and open up an office and start doing surgery on people. There's all kinds of licensing requirements. So that's a way to stop inadequate information to the buyer from the seller or the person offering the good or service. However, you can also have inadequate seller information about a buyer. Let's say you sell your house to someone and they write you a large check and it bounces. Or you sell your car to someone who gives you counterfeit money or a check that bounces. That would be an example. And they're generally, inadequate seller information about the buyer falls into 2 categories. Up first is moral hazard. And moral hazard is when you can shift some of your responsibility onto someone else. So what would an example of moral hazard be? You get really good car insurance and now decide to drive recklessly as hell, knowing if you wreck your car, it's going to be fully covered. That's an example of moral hazard. You're not acting how you represented yourself to, because you know now someone's going to be on the hook if you smash up your car. That's an example of moral hazard. So moral hazard is when, once again, people start behaving recklessly after entering into a contract that shifts the cost of bad outcomes to another party, something like car insurance. Adverse selection is the other type, and adverse selection is when the buyer knows information they're not disclosing to the seller. So if you lie that you have all of this money and you write a check you know is bad, that's adverse selection. If you decide to take out a life insurance policy but you know you have a terminal disease, that's adverse selection. Any of these examples are adverse selection. No insurance company would write you that policy if they knew you had this disease. No one would sell you a car if they knew the check you were paying for the car was going to bounce. So that's an example of adverse selection. Anytime you have asymmetric information via the buyer or the seller, it leads to inefficiency. Transactions that never would have happened had this information been known. Finally, our last word here, an example of governmental intervention and the fact that eventually you hit an optimum point of reducing something. The government wants to reduce air pollution, and they have to account for marginal benefits and costs. You can't shut every factory and power plant down. You would have no society if you did that. So what they do is create something like a cap and trade system where they set a total amount of emissions for the year and they assign people rights to pollute. And then you could buy and sell them. So if you use all wind power or you don't have old equipment and you barely pollute, you can sell your excess rights to pollute to other companies who might have older equipment or might have to burn coal or something like that. And it allows emissions to be reduced and also the externality to be reduced to a point that's beneficial for society. Companies which operate cleanly will continue to do so and probably increase the amount of clean energy they use to be able to sell more of these rights to the ones who cannot, and slowly we can overall reduce the amount of pollution in society. And on that note, that will bring us to the end of chapter 4.